No signs of progress in talks aimed at reaching a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And in besieged and battered Gaza, the humanitarian crisis worsens by the day, with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians on the brink of famine. Hello everyone, I'm Asiye Namdar, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. Egyptian state media reports ceasefire talks have extended in Cairo for another day. A senior Hamas official tells NBC News it is now up to the United States to pressure Israel to reach a deal. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says it's up to Hamas to accept an immediate ceasefire. Israel, we should add, is not at the talks because it says Hamas had rejected its demand to provide a list of all hostages who are still alive. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the United States and Jordan airdropped more aid amid a mounting hunger crisis. A lot to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Khalil Jahshan is the executive director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. Dan Arbell served in the Israeli Foreign Service. He's currently a scholar in residence at American University Center for Israeli Studies. Nabeel Khoury is a former U.S. diplomat. He's now a non-resident senior fellow at Washington's Arab Center. And Lynk served as the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Palestinian territories. Gentlemen, thank you all for coming on the program. I really want to start by talking about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which has been described as simply catastrophic. More than 30,000 Palestinians have now been killed in 5 months of conflict. Most of them are women and children. Let's listen to a Palestinian mother who is enduring perhaps the most heartbreaking loss, the loss of her twin babies killed in an Israeli strike in Rafah over the weekend. Take a listen.
Praise be to God. Our Allah honored me and blessed me with a daughter and a son. I gave birth in the middle of the 8th month. I gave birth in the war. War started on Saturday, and I gave birth on Friday. I didn't get enough of them. I swear I didn't get enough of them. And their father has gone. I have no one else. I have no one else.
That was Rania Abu Anza. It took her and her husband 10 years to conceive a child. Now they're gone. On top of everything else, risk of hunger and famine. Michael, let me turn to you. The scale of devastation we're seeing in Gaza, the magnitude of human suffering. Things were not good in Gaza before, but never anything like this.
No, of course, and it's only gotten worse in the 5 weeks since we've received the decision from the International Court of Justice at the end of January that ordered Israel, among other things, to allow the unimpeded entry of humanitarian aid in order to be able to care for the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. If anything, the humanitarian situation in the 5 weeks since that order was issued has gotten worse. Truck deliveries have gone down by 30 to 50% since January, which was already a catastrophic situation. And we learned in mid-February that 940,000 Palestinians were at phase 4 of the emergency levels of measuring famine and starvation, and another 380,000 Palestinians were at phase 5, which is a catastrophic level of starvation. There is no phase 6. And the ability of getting aid into Gaza has only decreased since those figures came out. We're now watching airdrops. Airdrops are among the most inefficient and most expensive way of trying to deliver aid to a starving population. And this represents a political failure, particularly by the United States, in its inability to tell Israel that it has to comply with the International Court of Justice orders with respect to humanitarian aid and allow the unimpeded flow of trucks into Gaza to reach all those who are starving.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of important points, and I want to dissect that. But before we do that, let me turn to Dan Arbell. It seems a ceasefire, Dan, is more urgent than ever before, considering what we just heard from Michael. What are you hearing about where things stand in Cairo? And can there really be any kind of agreement when Israel is not even present at the table?
So it's a tough set of negotiations now taking place in Cairo. And Israel demanded something very basic, to get the names of the hostages that Hamas holds that are alive and plans to trade, so to speak, and has not been able to get even that basic fact of who is alive, who's dead, the names, and so on and so forth, and decided to hold off on participating in this round. It's very unfortunate that we're at this stage that that Hamas is being very reluctant to move forward. The assumption was that things would be finalized before Ramadan, which begins next Monday, but now it looks like Hamas is interested in lighting up the region towards Ramadan, create a religious conflict, turn this into a religious conflict rather than a political or military conflict, and that's very unfortunate. I think the onus is on Hamas. Hamas needs to deliver. Once it does, I think a deal can go forward. Hostages would be released, ceasefire would be in place, and also humanitarian assistance could be, certainly increased into Gaza.
Back in November, and my question is for Khalil, there was a temporary pause in fighting, and we saw more than 100 hostages being released. But it seems like this time around, things have become so much more complicated. Why is that, Khalil, when they managed to do it back in November?
This is the nature of the beast. Whenever you have a conflict of this kind, so convoluted, multi-layered, complicated, and you play games with it. In other words, instead of moving quickly in a serious manner to resolve layer after layer of this conflict, it tends to get complicated. This is not new. Some of us who have been focused on this conflict are familiar with this. We've looked at it. We've seen this movie over the past 75 years. So continuing to avoid looking at the bottom line of this conflict and dealing with it in a straightforward manner does complicate it. Every time we postpone, whether it's in Gaza or throughout Palestine, this conflict, again, when we come back to it, we do not have the luxury of finding it at the same place where we left off. It always becomes worse.
And Nabeel, as Michael mentioned, U.S. has joined a number of other countries in airdropping aid, and U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, for the first time that I can recall, in a very urgent fashion, called for an immediate ceasefire, not a permanent one, but an immediate one over the weekend. Of course, critics would argue all of this is too little too late.
Indeed, it is. Not only that, but the airdrop itself is such a humiliation for the U.S. government. The U.S. has Israel as a very close ally. It has Americans on the ground in Israel, civilian and military. And if they were working well with the Israelis, they could have easily driven the food into Gaza. But the airdrop, maybe from the administration's point of view, makes it look dramatic. But actually, it makes the government look pathetic. And as for Kamala Harris, yes, it was an emotional speech. But at the end of it, she says that it's a temporary 6-week ceasefire that they're working towards. And then the very next day, she meets with Benny Gantz here in Washington and leads with the U.S. support for Israel's right to defend itself, as if nothing has changed in the past 4 or 5 months. So too little, too late, and really a bit of a hapless position for the U.S. government to be in.
Well, I want to perhaps pose this question to all of you gentlemen. Does U.S. have a credibility problem on the world stage because of its unconditional support for Israel. I mean, politically, we'll see what happens after Super Tuesday, but we certainly saw the impact for U.S. President Biden in Michigan. Yes, he won the primary, but many Arab Americans, Michigan has the largest Arab American voters in the United States, sent a message to U.S. President Biden that they are not happy with what they've seen. Jahshan, let me turn to you. Is this all going to translate at the ballot box in November?
It seems to already be translating or going in that direction. I think what we have witnessed the past few days with the primaries, probably 4 or 5 times the number of votes that were expected as choosing or describing themselves as uncommitted was actually achieved, which the signal is very clear to the White House that there is very serious upheaval at the grassroots level within the Democratic Party. These are mostly people who voted for President Biden the last elections. And their vote at this time is very critical, very crucial in a state that is very crucial. And that could tip the balance on November 5th. So credibility, yes, has been undermined, both as you implicated and implied in your question, globally and domestically.
Dan, would you agree with that?
I think Khalil is right. I think that the Biden administration is in a tough position. It's trying to balance between its basic stance of support for Israel to other voices within the Democratic Party who are very critical of that approach. And I think that it's a balancing act for the administration, and they're trying, with statements like Kamala Harris's statement and other actions to try and bring Israel to be more forthcoming in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of ending the war, at least reaching a ceasefire. So yeah, it's quite a challenge ahead, and I agree with Khalil that the administration will face many difficulties in the months ahead on this path.
We've also learned that the United States is now asking Israel to sign a letter promising it will not violate human rights with all the American weapons that it has sent to Israel. I'm just curious, Dan, are you getting the sense Israel will sign this letter?
I don't know. I think that Israel is facing a tough situation in itself as it faces a Gaza Strip, which Hamas is deeply embedded in civilian areas, within civilian population, using civilians as human shields. It's very, very hard to conduct a war in such a situation without having civilian casualties. And I think that Israel is being cautious as much as it can, but it cannot guarantee 100% that civilians are not hurt. And that's a problem. Regarding this letter, I think that Israel would commit to trying to do its utmost. I haven't seen the wording of that letter or what exactly it looks like, but I think that Israel would do its utmost to gain U.S. support and allay U.S. concerns regarding its actions.
Let me pick up on something you said, Dan, that Israel is doing this because it believes in a lot of the places it's destroying, schools, mosques, homes, entire neighborhoods, hospitals. They argue that Hamas militants are sheltering in some of these places. Israeli forces would say hospitals are being used as command and control centers for Hamas. I would like to pose this question for Michael, perhaps. Talk about the situation with hospitals in Gaza. Are they even functioning with so many basic shortages that are putting the risks of so many Palestinian patients, putting their lives at risk? Has there been any evidence, based on what you've heard and what you know, that Hamas uses these facilities, hospitals, as command and control centers?
Well, let's first of all look at the catastrophic health situation in Gaza. Of the 36 hospitals that were operating on October 6th in Gaza, I think the figure right now is only 13 or 14 of them are even partially, minimally functioning. They don't have access to anesthetics. They don't have access to operating equipment. The doctors are working with rudimentary 17th century methods in trying to treat the flow of patients coming in there. So there's been an almost complete blockage of the ability to deliver health aid to these hospitals that are still functioning to be able to care for the population. Hospitals and all civilian infrastructure, such as universities, schools, municipal buildings, court buildings, all of those are protected under international humanitarian law and the Fourth Geneva Convention, and hospitals first and foremost. And yet we've seen attacks on them. We've seen destruction and their inability to be able to operate by attacks on Israel, with minimal evidence with respect to that they were being used as fortifications for Hamas, or that Hamas had active control centers and command centers in them or underneath them. We've had a paucity of evidence for all that Israel had been saying prior to their attacks on the hospitals, and particularly Al-Shifa hospital, of what this is. But all of these buildings, we've seen lots of photos and video of schools and universities being deliberately blown up and after being dynamited and mined. Virtually anything that makes up civilian life has been erased, so that such that when this war finally is over, there's virtually nothing for the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza to be able to return to. And one has to think there's a deliberate strategy to want to thin out, if not eliminate, the Palestinian population in Gaza by Israel.
Very quickly, I want to get Khalil and Khalil's reaction, as well as Nabeel's, and then I want to get to a report that we heard from the United Nations yesterday about sexual abuse. But first, Nabeel, you go first. What do you agree with what Michael had to say?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's sort of painfully redundant to talk about the humanitarian situation, which gets worse by the minute. This is unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like that since World War II. And you know, the whole world should be moving to do something to stop this brutality. But the U.S. keeps frustrating international efforts by its veto at the UN. I should say that the administration, clearly from Kamala Harris's two different speeches in a matter of 2 days, they're thinking primarily of the election. They don't want to be outdone by Donald Trump in terms of support for Israel. And they have lost the moral high ground. Their emotional appeal every now and then for Palestinians is not at all credible. Nobody believes them. So they're in a tough spot, but of their own making. If there was bold leadership in Washington and truly moral leadership, we would see a different kind of Biden administration.
Khalil, what's going to happen if Israeli forces launch a ground invasion into Rafah? That seems to be the next big concern, despite pleas from United Nations, relief organizations. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, seems to be forging ahead with that plan. Where are these Palestinians in Rafah, which, by the way, Israel had declared Rafah a safe zone? Where are they supposed to go? Khalil, Jahshan, to you, and then to Dan.
Well, what you could expect is more of a disastrous and tragic situation. That's the reason even the closest ally of Israel in this fight, the United States, the Biden administration, is trying to basically advise Israel not to proceed with an invasion of Rafah unless there is a plan specifically to protect these tens and tens of thousands of refugees and displaced people that Israel either pushed or advised to go to that area to start with. The situation is dismal. I mean, you can't even possibly exaggerate what's happening. Frankly, if this continues for a few months, the 30,000 people dead thus far, 31,000 almost as of today, as we speak. That will be a joke compared to the 60, double that. Even some experts say 90,000 people that will die of disease and hunger over another 5 months of these shenanigans and illegal practices. And the U.S. Is talking from both sides of its mouth, as Nabeel just mentioned. If the U.S. is so concerned, the president or the vice president, about the humanitarian situation, that's the same administration that sent an aircraft carrier on October 7th to give Israel a morale boost. Why can't they send, out of concern for human being right now, a U.S. ship hospital to go to Ashdod and contribute to alleviating this dismal situation? One clinic is opened in Rafah today. The 16th baby died out of starvation in that place. If that doesn't motivate the president and the vice president, I don't know what would.
All right, gentlemen, there's a lot more to talk about. Let me move on to another point of contention. Israel had accused Hamas of sexual violence in that October 7th attack. We heard from the United Nations team, and they said there was grounds to support Israeli reports of sexual violence. Let's listen to what we heard from the UN Special Representative, Pramila Patten.
We found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, has been committed against captives. And we also have reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may still be ongoing against those still held in captivity. I pause and must add that I am of the strong opinion that this finding does not in any way legitimize further violence, but actually reinforces the need for an urgent ceasefire.
And gentlemen, just to add one more thing to that report, the UN also found sexual violence against Palestinian men and women also took place in detention centers in Israel during those raids and at checkpoints after October 7th. Michael, I just want to get your reaction to this UN report.
Look, it's very clear in international law that attacks on civilians are absolutely prohibited. Sexual violence has been something we've come to recognize over the last 20 to 25 years as an integral part of war that actually has to be opposed and constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even in certain circumstances it might lead to a finding of genocide as well. What Hamas did and what other Palestinian armed groups did on October 7th for attacking civilians, and now it seems at least a plausible case of sexual violence and rape, as well as taking hostages. All of those are contrary to international law and the Fourth Geneva Convention. You may have the most just of causes to want to fight for, but if you wind up using illegitimate and illegal methods, you wind up staining your own cause. And I should also add, though, nothing that had happened on October 7th, no matter how awful the atrocities were, justifies committing breaches of international law leading to a plausible case of genocide by the other side as well. So I would welcome the findings of the UN special representative with respect to this. I would hope we can find ways of holding those accountable with respect to this. But this has to be seen in the context of the entire war, and that it doesn't add any more legitimacy to what Israel's actions have been over the past 5 months.
Nabeel, your take on this rather disturbing report?
I agree very much with what has been said. I do not exonerate Hamas fighters, individuals also not belonging to Hamas who went in with them when they broke out through the gates of Gaza. I don't exonerate them from committing crimes and for acting in an awful way. But you do not do collective punishment for over 2 million people for individual actions. And we've seen collective punishment repeatedly in Gaza. They say that there's a Hamas fighter in a building 4 or 5 stories high. They bring down the whole building. They've wiped out entire neighborhoods. I'm all for punishing individuals for their crimes, but there are ways of doing it without this total destruction that we're seeing.
And finally, I want to pose a question to all of you, and I'm going to start with Dan. Is there a sense in Israel, Dan, first of all, that what Israel has done with this massive military operation, with mounting civilian casualties, mounting suffering, people losing their homes, their neighborhoods, their families shattered, is there a sense in Israel that when it's all said and done, this will make Israel safer?
So, first of all, there's broad consensus in Israel in support of the government's actions and the war effort. When all is said and done, it depends how the war ends. Israel wants to remove Hamas out of the equation. And if Hamas is still there after the war, then nothing has been achieved, really. And so I think Israel has very clear objectives in what it wants to achieve. Once those are achieved, the war can end. Actually, the war can end today if Hamas surrenders and returns the hostages. That's not going to happen, probably. So there's a long road ahead, and the fight is not over. And it really depends a lot on how this war will end. And right now, it's not clear at all.
Well, some might argue that this entire operation will, in fact, create another generation of terrorists out for revenge. When you've lost everything, when you have no hope and you have nothing to lose, that could happen. I don't know. It's a complicated issue. Nabeel, let me go to you and then to Khalil with final words.
Well, Israel has practiced violence against Palestinians since its creation, and it has defeated Arab armies and is fighting popular armed forces in the region. This has not brought them any closer to security and to peace. I would say unless they totally change this approach and think of politically and diplomatically solving their problems and working out a solution with the Palestinians that is humane and politically acceptable to everybody in the area, then they're going to continue to live in a state of war.
Even if Israel is successful in eliminating Hamas, eradicating Hamas, can it destroy the ideology, Khalil?
I don't think so. And it's not ideology as much as a political way of life. I mean, ideology can also, frankly, even though people have made it a cliche, can also be destroyed somehow. But the idea itself of having an Islamist political persuasion, if you will, being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or having a Muslim political orientation, Islamist political orientation, that cannot be destroyed. Israel knows that as well as we do, and therefore, they can defeat Hamas 100 times in Gaza, but that will not achieve the objective. But Palestine will not be Hamas free the way some Israelis naively in the leadership perceive their war objectives as including.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Khalil, Dan, Nabeel, and Michael, thank you all for joining our conversation. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington, and thank you for watching.